Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Aram Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday evening and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Toldot. Isaac and Jacob choose brides from Aram. Aramaic is the chosen language of the Talmud and of our liturgy. The Kaddish is in Aramaic, and we start our Seder in Aramaic. Aramaic was also the universal language, the lingua franca of antiquity. So why is Laban so vilified? Tonight on Thanksgiving, we ask, should we slander or offer thanks to the Arameans? Join us for Lost and Found in Translation. Well, welcome, Rabbi. I don't know about you, but my tummy is full. I am still digesting my Thanksgiving meal. But I must say that we living in this country have a lot to be thankful for. And so I wish you... We sure
do, and it's nice that we're able to go from Thanksgiving dinner to talking about the parsha. What could be better than that?
Absolutely. So, as I said in the introduction, we are going to talk about Aramaic, which for anyone who studied the Talmud knows that is the language used in the Talmud. If the beginning of the Passover Seder sounds a little strange when we say halachma anya da achlav hatna, that's Aramaic. When you say Kaddish, I was recently in Israel and was with a family in mourning, and Israelis have a tough time saying Kaddish because we don't realize it's not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic. So we are going to talk about this people called Aram. We were introduced to them, as I said, last week when Abraham sent his servant Eliezer. He said, I don't want my son marrying a Canaanite. He said, go to Aram and meet my family and get him a bride from there. And we didn't really get into it, but already we started to see a little bit of a distaste for Laban, who was the son of a patriarch there, and even though he's mentioned first, so the rabbis in their commentaries say he's arrogant, and then when he goes out to hug Avimelech, maybe he hugged him a little too tightly, and the rabbis say he was checking for coins. There isn't a nice thing that they say about him, and it's a kind of a prequel to what's going to happen in the parshiot that are coming up, where Jacob goes down to Laban's house, and we have all of the storm and drang of getting married to Leah instead of Rachel, and then working for so many years. So there's definitely, on the one hand, we see that both Abraham and Isaac definitely want their children to find a bride amongst the Arameans. But on the other hand, there's a little bit of a distaste for them. You don't find that when it talks about the Canaanites. With the Canaanites is, don't marry them, these are not good people. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Are you with me?
I'm with you. This is a great topic.
Okay, so in Genesis 25:20, which is in our portion, it says, Isaac was 40 years old when he took to wife Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, of Padam Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean. So if you count Aram, which you should, as a reference to the territory under the tutelage of the Arameans, in one verse you have reference to Aram or the Arameans 3 times. And I do think that later on, calling someone an Aramean wasn't necessarily shvach. It wasn't necessarily something that put them on a pedestal. And then later in the Parsha, It talks about, again, that Isaac sent for Jacob after Jacob stole the birthright or negotiated the birthright. And he said, "You shall not take a wife from among the Canaanite women. Up, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take a wife there from among the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." So there's a sense of them being family, and a sense of go back to this Laban guy, and it continues again with a real emphasis on this Aram and Aram over and over. And I want to give a little context for my interest in Aramean. Besides the fact that you and I, Rabbi, both studied the Talmud in it and were exposed to this language, I think that in recent times, one of the things that kind of brought some interest in Aramaic was when Mel Gibson did The Passion of the Christ. And I remember that I was in a study session with my rabbi, and we were talking about Mel Gibson, and we were deciding, you can't really buy a ticket to see it because he was considered an anti-Semite. So I did go and buy a ticket for another movie, and then I sat in the back just to hear the Aramaic. And I closed my eyes, and sure enough, I could understand it. And then there was what's happened in Syria, the civil war in Syria, where there are just a few remnants of people that still speak Aramaic. And this hit them very hard. And then in 2021, a book was written. It's, I think, at least 300 pages long. It's a scholarly book, and it's called Aramaic, A History of the First World Language. And what happened as a result of that is that I started to kind of read about Aramaic as the first lingua franca. I had never heard of that term before. But really, I learned very quickly that there was almost a 1,200-year period where Aramaic was what we consider English today, where even if it wasn't your mother tongue, it was the language of diplomacy. It was the language of science. It was the language of commerce. And it was, in a sense, you could even say it was the internet. It was what united all of these people. And I'll just read a little bit about how important that became. This is from the Atlantic magazine, and it says, Aramaic then is in a splintered and tenuous state, yet it was the English of its time, a language that united a large number of distinct peoples across a vast region, a key to assessing life beyond one's village, a mark of sophistication to many. The Arameans, according to biblical law, named for Noah's grandson Aram, started as a little-known nomadic group, but they were seekers, and by the 11th century BC, they ruled large swaths of territory in Mesopotamia, encompassing parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, including for a spell the city of Babylon itself. And then they expanded, but what happened was that their empire, and it never was a great empire, was defeated by the Babylonians. And the Arameans themselves were in Babylon only temporarily. In 911 BCE, the Assyrians, who spoke a language called Akkadian, ousted them. But the Assyrians unwittingly helped the Arameans' language extinguish their own. Namely, the Assyrians deported Aramaic speakers far and wide. So as a Jew, when you read this and you think of these Arameans being dispersed into Galut, to Egypt and elsewhere, the Assyrians may have thought they were clearing their new territory, but this was like blowing on a fluffy millweed and drinking of its own destruction rather than dissemination. The little seeds took root. And ultimately, Aramaic became this language that united everybody. And he makes a point that if for the Jews, Hebrew was a local language, Aramaic was an international language. And so what I'm going to kind of explore today is how, in a sense, kind of bound together the success and the growth of Judaism through the Middle East was kind of just tied to the fact that they used this language of Aramaic, and in a sense, their paths were very similar to the Aramaics. Have you ever thought about this in this way? I mean, lingua franca was a new concept to me.
It's a great idea. I mean, and the fact that there's such an intersection between Jewish history and Aramaic means that this conversation is an important conversation to have. To try to figure out what was that connection originally, and how did that connection evolve over time? I think it's a fascinating question.
So the first time that we have Aramaic in the Bible is actually coming up in Genesis 31, and it is a translation. So if you recall, or you'll see in a week or two, when finally Jacob takes Leah and Rachel and his two Pilagshim with him, and he has his 12 children, and they flee from Laban's house, and Laban catches up to them. So they get to a point where they kind of settle their differences. There's accusations, and they say, let's make a pact. And it says, come then, let us make a pact, you and I, this is Laban and Jacob, that there may be a witness between you and me. Thereupon Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. So they took stones and make a mound, and they partook of a meal there by the mound. Laban named it Yigar Saduta, but Jacob named it Gal-Aid. So Gal-Aid, Gal is a stone. If you remember last week, we talked about Gilgal, where the flint was used to circumcise all the Jews coming out of Egypt. And Aid is a witness. Adim is two witnesses. And what Laban did was he used Aramaic, and it's quoted in the text, Yigar Saduta. Saduta is witnesses, and Yigar in Aramaic is a stone. So when you and I studied the first chapter of Talmud that we studied together, Elu Mitzios, that we talk about frequently, in Baba Metzia 3a, it talks about two guys holding on to a talus. This one says it's mine, and the other one says it is mine. And the Talmud brings up this concept that we in modern day law call possession is 99% of the law. And they say that in the case they found, since each litigant is holding part of the garment, it is clear to us that what is in this one's grasp is his, and what is in that one's grasp is his. And the Talmud says, Hacha kevon de tafis anan sahadi, demai de tafis hai didaihu. We have Anan Sahadi. Now, Anan Sahadi has the same word that we just came across in the Aramaic quoted in the Bible, which is witnesses. Anan is we. So we are witnesses. But if I were to say to any Talmudist, this is the concept of Anachnu Edim, they would look at me blankly. But Anan Sahadi, any Talmudist would know, is this principle of possession. And so what I'm trying to get across is that Aramaic became our legal language where we created institutions that formed Jewish law and Jewish thinking. So this use of Aramaic wasn't simply translating from the Hebrew, but was the language of our creativity. And we have to understand that we owe the Arameans that.
Well, we took Aramaic and turned it into our Talmudic language. And our Talmudic language is our legal language. Our legal code was created in the Talmud. So Anansade becomes the term because that became our language. That was the language of the Jewish legal process, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. But again, it wasn't at that point a translation in Hebrew. It was, this was the language where they were...
It was its own tradition, and I think that's still true.
They were creating these principles. So, I mentioned before that when Aviezer went to see Laban, Laban was criticized because he gave him a hug and maybe he was checking his pockets. The Arameans were considered, and that came across in what I quoted from the Atlantic article. They were merchants. They were hagglers. The reason why the Aramaic language was used throughout the ancient Near East, because it was the language of commerce. I didn't even mention how far it went. Anyone who's eaten in an Indian restaurant and orders tandoori chicken, tandoor comes from the Aramaic tanur. The point is, this was everywhere, and it was the language, first and foremost, not a philosophical thought or theology, but a language of negotiation and a language of commerce. And it just seems to me that if we look at Aramaic and Aram in that fashion, then maybe we can see and recognize in Aramaic and the Arameans ourselves a little bit more. I mean, here we have a parsha where there's a sale of a birthright, where there's within the legal boundaries maneuvering, where Jacob changes his dress and maybe thereby shows his father to look at him differently. But certainly you can make a case that the people that the characters that we are seeing here are, in fact, very similar to each other, and that there's a very good reason that Abraham will say, go to Laban's house. They were both minorities. They were both survivors. They were both learned how to navigate inside of another society, and that, in fact, is what took Aramaic and made it the lingua franca. And I would say that it wore off on Judaism as well. Does anything resonate there?
Everything does, but I want to go back to what you started with. And that is, you said that being an Aramean isn't so good. Because in the Haggadah, we talk about Laban the Aramean. And that's bad, right? Laban the Aramean. So I want to suggest that we never had a bad view towards Aram. Aram was always Abraham's family. In those days, in the ancient world, it was all about family. It was all about your clan, all about your family. Laban actually was part of the clan, was part of the family. Laban was a bad guy, but the family was good. I know it, because his sister married Isaac and his daughters married Jacob. So he was, so his family was okay. So I think we always had a positive attitude towards Arameans.
So I love it that you quoted the Haggadah, where I would say the core of Magid, of what we have to do in the Haggadah, of telling the story, is told around verses from Deuteronomy 26. It's Thanksgiving today, so why shouldn't I come out and say it? It was the wording that is considered very ancient for the Bikurim, the first fruits, which is basically a prayer of thanksgiving. It's the farmer coming to the temple with his crop, as the pilgrims did after the harvest in the fall, and are thanking God for giving them this harvest. And even though the Haggadah says, as you quote, that Laban tried to destroy our forefathers, the Hebrew itself is not quite that clear. in Deuteronomy 26, it says, "My father was a fugitive Aramean." So the key word here is Arami Oved Avi. Oved can mean lost, like a lost Elu Mitzir Shalom. There's something that is lost and found. And it can also mean someone who's going to be killed, like when Esther says, Kasher avadati avadati. If I will be killed, I will be killed. But I think the more obvious explanation, especially understanding the history of the Arameans, is that they were fugitives. And Abraham, in fact, in this Thanksgiving benediction, in this Thanksgiving formula, is saying that we come from people who are fugitives. We are related to the Arameans. And there's nothing negative about that. And then he talks about that our narrative was we went down to Egypt, and then he goes on and to thank. So I think even here, you're right, you don't have to interpret anything about Laban and the Arameans as negative. It can be interpreted that way, but it also can be interpreted lishvach, to give the correspondence between us. And I think that's kind of fascinating.
I think that is fascinating. I really think, yeah. So but that little piece turns the whole conversation. Means Aram has always been where we came from. We always had a soft spot for Aram. So the fact that Aramaic became our language is not surprising. Now, one little piece that you didn't mention is the fact that there actually are sections of the Tanakh, of the Jewish Bible, that are written in Aramaic. Some of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah are written in Aramaic, and some of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. That's because after the first exile, the first temple is destroyed in 586. The Jews are exiled to Babylonia. They speak Aramaic in Babylonia. So part of the Tanakh, the later books of the Tanakh, are written in Aramaic because that's the language that people spoke.
Absolutely. And I was blown away by discovering a very strange verse in 2 Kings 18. It's where the city of Jerusalem is surrounded by a conquering nation, and the conquering general gets on the megaphone, and he starts speaking Hebrew, lay down your arms. And in 2 Kings 18:26, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Joah replied to Rab Shebekeh, that's the name of the general, please, speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in Judean in the hearing of the people on the wall. So he says, Adabrech Aramit, and he says, Va'al tidaber imanu Yehudit. So to your point, not only are parts of our scripture, like books of Daniel, written in Aramaic, but it's perfectly believable that there were times where the Jews did actually not understand Hebrew, where Aramaic had replaced Hebrew as their mother tongue.
I think that that's absolutely correct. You know, it's not clear, but in the Talmudic period, when the lingua franca was Aramaic, did they also speak Hebrew, or they didn't know how to speak Hebrew? You know, I understand that for davening, for prayer service, they spoke Hebrew. But what about as a language? It's almost like American Jews. You say, American Jews, we speak English. American Jews can't speak Hebrew as a conversational language, most American Jews. So was that the same thing in these countries, that the Jews spoke Aramaic, but they couldn't speak Hebrew? The answer is we don't know, but isn't that an interesting question?
It absolutely is. And, in the past, a few weeks ago, I talked about the tradition of studying Chumash and Rashi. Every week, you would study a Chumash, the portion of the week, the Bible, and then you would study the great classical commentator. But there's actually a much older tradition in that. In the Talmud, in Barachot, it has the famous dictum, Shnayim Mikra ve'echad Targum, that every week you should go through the Parsha twice in Hebrew and once in Targum. And Targum in modern day Hebrew means in translation. But we know the Targum there are two famous Targumim. One is Targum Yonatan and the other is Onkelos. Onkelos was a convert to Judaism who made the translation. Now, there were other translations of the Torah. There's the Septuagint into Greek, but you will never find a dictum in the Talmud saying that you have to read it twice in Hebrew and once in the Targum. That is Aramaic. That put the Aramaic translation on a pedestal. It almost had the same holiness as the scripture in Hebrew.
And you know that the Teimanim, the Yemenites, to this very day, if you go to a Yemenite synagogue in Israel, so they actually still read the Targum. When they read the Torah every Shabbat, they actually pause after each couple of verses and they read the Aramaic Targum. Isn't that great? Which means that at least in Yemen, at least there were some people who actually understood the Targum and ran with it.
It's absolutely amazing. And then we have to understand that we all know that translation is always commentary. You can't translate something without giving it an explanation. But the Targum, and we came across this a few weeks ago when we talked about how God regretted creating mankind. And we saw that the Targum clearly had a problem with the anthropomorphic emotions of regret, and they added a few words. In our Parsha, when we get to Jacob stealing the blessing, it says in Genesis 27:35, in the Hebrew it says, "Vayome ba'achicha b'mirama v'yikach brechatecha," and he answered, "Your brother came with guile and took away your blessing." In the Targum it says, "Yitzchak, your brother, came with chachma and received your blessing." It says, "V'amar ala chochach b'chachmata v'kabel birchatacha." So here, and this gets a little bit to what I was saying about what we Jews as minorities have in common with these cousins of ours, the Arameans, was that haggling was not something that was looked down upon. It was a survival. It was a chachma. And so here we have not only an example in the Targum Onkelos of translating and also explaining, but also a sense of maybe the culture of a language came through, and unlike every other translation, this culture was embraced by the rabbis because the Targum was held in such high esteem.
I think that's great. I love that. I think that that's really kind of a wonderful, this is an interesting choice for Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving is about how we embrace the culture of the land where we live. And what you're really talking about is that idea of embracing the culture of the land where we live is actually the oldest Jewish tradition. That goes all the way back to the Torah and to the Arameans. And the fact that our connection to Abraham's family and the Arameans, that continued through the generations, and that we can learn about our culture, not only about the language that we use, but the way that we did business, the way that we operated was very similar to the Arameans. And sometimes you learn it actually from that's a famous Targum Onkelos, means that, b'chochma means, with intelligence, that's the way we did business. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful that's a wonderful message for us on this Thanksgiving. So I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, a Shabbat Shalom. Today we gave you something to think about, not only for this week's Parsha, but for the whole Jewish history. And so enjoy it this week, and we look forward to continuing next week with Parshat Vayetze. Shabbat Shalom. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, happy Thanksgiving, and I am going to continue a little bit discussing a little bit of what Christianity and Aramaic had to do together, because I think part of the story of Aramaic is it took the Jewish message and made it something that the world could absorb. So there are twice in the New Testament that Jesus is quoted by his own words, and they're Aramaic. And one is when he's on the cross, he quotes Psalms 22:2, and he goes, God, why have you forsaken me? But he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani in Matthew 27. And that, again, comes from the Targum. There's another time where a girl comes to him, and I think she might have been a prostitute piece. People were throwing her down, and Jesus says to her, Taleta kumi. And Taleta is a young girl. So it gives us a sense that the fact that the Torah was translated into Aramaic made it available to the whole ancient Middle East, and possibly or probably responsible for the creation and the internationalization of a rabbi named Jesus, whose message became universal, and then it was replaced by Arabic, but clearly the Aramaic led to Islam as well. So it really was the feather inside of that pillow that the author quoted before is talking about. And it's really part of making the message of Judaism universal, because it was in this international language. And I just find
fantastic.
I find that fascinating. And I think we therefore, the conclusion is, do we curse or do we bless Aram and the Aramaics? And I think we have to actually welcome them as brothers, the same way that the Pilgrims welcomed the Indians, and thank them and appreciate the fact that we rode a little bit, our wandering rode on their wandering. So Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you so much.
All the best. Bye-bye. Hey, Euro, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. I found the topic quite interesting. On this topic of the lingua franca, I think it's quite interesting, too, how this developed over time, because obviously it was heavily influenced by the Akkadian language, which was the lingua franca prior to that. So that's why I was a little surprised when you gave this example of Tandoor. And I know in this book, I did a quick search online, and I guess it does make a reference to the Aramaic word. But I mean, if you look at the etymology of the word, they all tend to point to the Akkadian word, and that predates the Aramaic form by anywhere from like 300 to like 1500 years or more. And there's an example of it because it's actually written in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is clearly before the spread of like the early form of Aramaic. So I think the author kind of, I don't know what happened, but kind of slipped on that one.
You think he took a little license on that one? I think that the point was more important than the example, that there's no question that Aramaic reached to India. But I would question, and I wonder what your opinion of this is, that the thing that made Aramaic lingua franca was that it was spoken outside of the empire of Aram, and after Aram, the empire of Aram was destroyed. It really took on a life of itself in commerce. And as I was researching this, there are stela that have images of scribes standing in front of the king, and one is chiseling the Akkadian on a tablet, and the other is writing the Aramean and into a scroll. But I do think that there's no question there also Semitic languages, they all are related. I took a class at Columbia for Moshe Held in Akkadian wisdom literature back in the day. And he would read to us, and you could close your eyes, and you could make out, if you knew Hebrew, if you knew Aramaic, you could make out 50, 60% of it. They were all related. But I do believe that Aramaic was kind of unique in its longevity and its geographical spread that make it maybe arguably one of the first lingua francas.
Depends obviously like what type of region you're talking about. So yeah, the Aramaic language was a lingua franca over, let's say, two or three empires, okay? But, prior to that, Akkadian was. So I think I would grant more the time element more than I would think the geographic element.
Okay, I totally accept that. I do believe this whole concept, and many of the at least the popular writers who write about this, talk about English and talk about what would happen. And the internet and how we look at this world today, and we kind of take it for granted that we can discourse amongst and around borders, over cultures, and to think that far back there was a language that, whether it's Akkadian first or Aramaic afterwards, is just a fascinating concept, I believe, in terms of the ability to spread ideas, the abilities to communicate across cultures and boundaries. I just found that very, very appealing and refreshing and fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting, too, the fact that languages like Aramaic, for instance, dominate after the climax of the people that the language is from. So in other words, it's in the decline of the people that the language becomes predominant. And we've seen that time and again, same thing with French. French became predominant lingua franca after the climax of the French power in the beginning of the decline. And some could argue, the same thing with English. So it's kind of interesting how it's a trailing. It appears to be a trailing effect, and the same thing with Greek, obviously.
Yeah, fascinating, and I guess we should be thankful for that. Which I guess proves that a culture is stronger than military, political, and material power, even economic power. So that's kind of an interesting thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. And part of the proof of that, in a way, too, is the Hebrew language in Judaism. Like this culture and religion was kept despite being, dominated, and almost to the point of extinction in terms of, politically and militarily, etc. So yet the culture continued and is being revived today.
Yeah, I think what was fascinating to me, and what I think what the Hebrew culture and the Aramean culture did have in common, is that they never were that dominant force. Even Aram in its day, it just wasn't one of these great empires. And Israel obviously never was a great world empire. But nonetheless, through their language or the culture, maybe there were some commonalities in terms of just the stickiness or some magic that we can't even put our finger on, but they did have that in common, that certainly what they had to offer far outlasted any military, economic, or political power that they may or may never even have had.